There is a member of Queen that most people who love Queen have almost stopped knowing how to think about. His name is John Deacon. He was the bassist. He wrote Some Things That Glitter, another one, Bites the Dust, I Want to Break Free, and Friends Will Be Friends. He was one of the four people responsible for some of the most enduring music of the 20th century. And in 1997, at a performance connected to the Bejart Ballet in Paris, he walked off a stage for the last time and has not appeared in public, given an interview, or made a statement of any kind since. Not once. Not in 27 years. The silence is so complete, so sustained, so unlike anything that the remaining members of Queen have maintained, that it has become one of the most discussed mysteries in rock music, not because anyone suspects something sinister, but because the silence itself is so eloquent that it feels like a communication more powerful than any interview could have been. Roger Taylor has spoken about John Deacon many times across those 27 years. He has spoken carefully with evident affection and with a consistent restraint that suggests he is saying less than he knows. What John Deacon said to Roger Taylor after the final performance in 1997 in those last minutes before the door closed and the silence began is the thing that Roger Taylor has protected more carefully than almost anything else in a life spent navigating the specific difficulties of being a surviving member of Queen. This is that story. John Deacon occupied a specific and irreplaceable position within Queen that was easy to overlook precisely because he performed it with such consistency and such apparent effortlessness. He was the quietest member of the band by every measure, the least talkative in interviews, the least present in the mythology that accumulated around the group, the least inclined to perform his own personality for public consumption. Brian May was the guitarist whose technical ambition and emotional expressiveness were visible in everything he did. Roger Taylor was the drummer whose energy and extroversion made him a natural foil to Freddie Mercury's theatricality. Freddie was Freddie, the gravitational center around which the entire enterprise orbited. And John Deacon was the bassist who stood slightly to the side of all of this, playing with absolute precision, contributing songs that turned out to be among the band's biggest commercial successes, and saying as little as possible about any of it. This was not shyness in the ordinary sense. It was a considered relationship with public exposure, a decision made early and maintained consistently that his private self was not part of what he owed the audience. He gave the music. He gave the bass lines. He gave the songs. The rest was his. When Freddie Mercury died on the 24th of November, 1991, each member of Queen lost someone they had known and worked alongside for more than 2 decades. But the shape of that loss was not identical for all three of them. Brian May and Roger Taylor had the resource, and eventually the inclination, to continue to find ways of honoring Freddie's memory that also allowed them to keep making music, keep touring, keep being, in some form, Queen. John Deacon did not have that resource, or did not access it, or made a different calculation about what continuing would cost and what it would mean. People who knew him during the period immediately following Freddie's death have described a man who was, in the most fundamental sense, done. Not destroyed. Grief is not the same as destruction, but finished with a particular chapter of his life in a way that was total and that did not seem to include any ambiguity about whether he might eventually return to it. He had been in Queen since 1971. He had given the band more than 20 years of his life, and the person who had been at the center of those 20 years was gone. The question of whether to continue was, for John Deacon, apparently not a difficult one. It was simply answered. The 1992 Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Wembley Stadium was the first major public reckoning with what Queen would look like without Freddie. 72,000 people attended. The remaining three members performed alongside a roster of guest vocalists: George Michael, Annie Lennox, David Bowie, Elton John, among others, in a concert that was both a genuine act of mourning and a demonstration of the band's enduring commercial and cultural significance. John Deacon was present. He played. He stood on the Wembley stage where Queen had performed some of their defining concerts, and he contributed to a tribute to the person whose absence made the whole occasion necessary. People who watched him that night have described a man who was present in the physical sense, and elsewhere in every other sense, who played with his characteristic precision, but who appeared to be doing so from a very great distance, as if the connection between himself and the enterprise had already been partially severed, and what remained was the professional obligation to see this particular thing through. He fulfilled that obligation, and then he continued to withdraw. The Made in Heaven album, released in 1995, was constructed from recordings Freddie Mercury had made during the final years of his life, completed and arranged by Brian May and Roger Taylor into what became the last official Queen studio album. John Deacon contributed to this process, but his involvement was, by every account, progressively diminishing. He came to sessions when required. He did what was needed. He did not initiate. He did not push for more time or more material or more involvement than the work strictly demanded. The people who worked on Made in Heaven alongside him have described his participation in terms that suggest someone who was completing an obligation, honoring a commitment to a process that had been set in motion before he had fully decided to stop, rather than someone who was genuinely invested in continuing. By the time the album was finished, John Deacon had already made the decision that would become public in 1997. He simply had not yet had occasion to make it permanent in front of other people. The occasion arrived in January 1997. The Bejart Ballet Lausanne was performing a piece called Le Presbytère n'est plus rien perdu de son charme, ni le jardin de son éclat, a work inspired by and dedicated to Freddie Mercury and his friend the choreographer Maurice Bejart. Queen Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon performed alongside the ballet. It was a private, cultural event rather than a commercial concert. It was, in almost every way, the kind of occasion that felt appropriate as a final performance, not a stadium tour, not a televised special, but something intimate and specific and connected to Freddie's actual life and relationships. John Deacon played that night. He played well. He performed everything that was required of him with the precision and the commitment that had characterized his playing across his entire career. And when it was over, when the performance ended and the stage cleared and the event dissolved into the specific quiet that follows live music, he said what he had come to say. Not in a press release, not in an interview, not in a public statement of any kind. He said it to Roger Taylor in the way that people who have known each other for a long time say the most important things, quietly, directly, without ceremony. What happened in those final minutes backstage after the Bejart performance is known, in full, only to the people who were present. Roger Taylor was there. Brian May was there. Others may have been present. But the specific exchange between John Deacon and Roger Taylor, the words that passed between them and what both men understood, with varying degrees of explicitness, to be a farewell is the thing that Roger Taylor has carried with him across the 27 years since, and has spoken about only in fragments, in the most careful and oblique language. In interviews where the question has been asked with enough persistence and enough gentleness that he has been willing to approach it without quite reaching it. What those fragments add up to is something like this. John Deacon was not angry. He was not bitter. He was not making a statement about Brian May or Roger Taylor or the future of Queen or anything that could be read as a critique or a grievance. He was simply, in the most complete and unambiguous way he knew how to communicate, saying that he was finished, that the thing they had all been part of together, the specific thing, the thing that had been the four of them, was finished, and that he was going to go and be, for the rest of his life, someone other than the bassist of Queen. Roger Taylor has said in interviews across the years that he understood John Deacon's decision. He has said this in a way that sounds like genuine understanding rather than diplomatic acceptance, as though the thing John said to him that night in Paris in January 1997 made a kind of sense that did not require argument or persuasion or the passage of time to appreciate. Roger Taylor is, by nature and by practice, someone who processes things outwardly, who talks, who performs, who continues to make music and give interviews and engage with the public life that being a surviving member of Queen requires. John Deacon is the precise opposite, and the specific thing John said to Roger in those final backstage minutes was, in Roger Taylor's telling, or rather in the telling he has not quite given, but has consistently implied a communication so completely in keeping with who John Deacon has always been, that resisting it would have been a form of not knowing him at all. Roger Taylor has never spoken about it fully, Not because the words were devastating or scandalous or impossible to share, but because they were private, said in confidence, in the specific confidence of two people who have known each other for 3 decades, in a moment that belonged to both of them and to no one else. The reason Roger Taylor has maintained this particular silence for 27 years is not mystery for its own sake, and not protection of a secret for strategic reasons. It is something simpler and more human than either of those things. John Deacon asked to disappear. Not in those words, not as a formal request, but in the way that the communication of a complete and final decision communicates itself. The request was implicit in everything that was said. Roger Taylor understood it, and honoring it has meant, among other things, not telling the story of how it was communicated, not reducing a private farewell to a public anecdote, not making John Deacon's exit into something that John Deacon himself would have found intolerable, a moment of exposure, a piece of content, a revelation to be consumed by an audience that John had spent his entire career keeping at arm's length. The silence Roger Taylor has maintained about that conversation is itself an act of loyalty to a man whose primary request of the world has always been to be left alone to live his life in private. After 1997, Queen continued, this is the fact that sits most uncomfortably alongside John Deacon's exit, and that Roger Taylor and Brian May have had to navigate with care in every interview they have given since. Queen without John Deacon is not the original Queen. Everyone knows this. Brian May and Roger Taylor know it better than anyone, and they have said so in various ways across the decades. The decision to continue performing as Queen, first with Paul Rogers as vocalist, then with Adam Lambert, was made with John Deacon's knowledge, but without his involvement. He was informed. He did not object, publicly. He also did not participate. The bass parts on the Made in Heaven tour were played by someone else. The arena shows that followed were attended by hundreds of thousands of people who loved Queen, many of whom noticed the absence of the fourth member and understood what it meant without needing to be told. John Deacon was not there. He was at home. He had been at home since January 1997, and he appeared, from everything that could be observed from the outside, to be entirely at peace with that. The anatomy of John Deacon's withdrawal is not difficult to understand if you understand who John Deacon has always been. He was never in Queen for the fame. He was never in it for the performance of personality or the accumulation of celebrity or any of the things that the music industry offers its most successful participants. He was in it for the music and for the specific configuration of people that made the music possible. And when that configuration was irreversibly altered by Freddie Mercury's death, the thing that had kept him in it was gone. Brian May and Roger Taylor found or created a reason to continue. John Deacon found that he did not need to. He had a family. He had a private life that he had always maintained in parallel with the public one, and that had never been less important to him than the band. He had enough money to never need to perform again. And he had, somewhere in the years between 1991 and 1997, arrived at a clarity about what he wanted the rest of his life to look like that did not include standing on stages and playing bass and being, for the benefit of other people, a member of a band whose reason for existing had walked out of Garden Lodge on the 24th of November, 1991, and not come back. Roger Taylor has spoken about John Deacon in interviews with a consistency that reveals more than it states. He has described John as someone he misses, not in the past tense, not as someone he mourns, the way he mourns Freddie, but in the present tense, as someone who is still alive and still in some sense present in Roger's life, but differently than before. He has described occasional contact between them, not frequent, not the regular communication of people who are actively part of each other's lives, but the specific, intermittent contact of people who have known each other for 50 years and who maintain, at whatever distance their different choices have put between them, a connection that does not require regular maintenance to remain real. He has been careful in all of these descriptions to convey respect for John's choices without performing grief about them. John made a decision. Roger Taylor understands it. And the thing that was said between them in Paris in January 1997 is part of why he understands it as well as he does. To the fans who have followed Queen across the decades, John Deacon's absence has become one of the defining mysteries of the band's later history, not because it is genuinely mysterious, but because it is so complete. In an era where almost everyone who was famous in the 1980s has found a way to remain publicly present through social media, through tribute tours, through the various mechanisms that the entertainment industry provides for the maintenance of relevance, John Deacon's total withdrawal from public life has the quality of a deliberate act, which it is. He does not have social media accounts. He does not give interviews. He does not attend Queen-related events. He did not appear at any of the screenings or press events around the 2018 Bohemian Rhapsody film, which depicted him and which told, in its selective and sometimes inaccurate way, the story of the band he had been part of. He was not consulted about the film in any meaningful creative sense. He was informed about it. And he continued to be, as he has been since 1997, somewhere private and unreachable, living a life that has nothing to do with being John Deacon of Queen. What John Deacon said to Roger Taylor after the final performance in 1997 was not, in the end, a secret in the conventional sense. It was not information that Roger Taylor has been protecting because it is dangerous or damaging or impossible to share. It was a private communication between two people who had known each other for a very long time, made in a moment that both of them understood as significant, and that Roger Taylor has chosen to honor by not translating it into public property. The content of what was said is less important than the fact of how it was said, with the completeness and the directness of someone who has thought carefully about what he is doing and has arrived at a decision that requires no justification and no further discussion. John Deacon said goodbye, not to Roger Taylor, the person they have remained in intermittent contact, but to the shared enterprise, the shared identity, the shared life that had been theirs for more than 25 years. He said it quietly, in the way he has always done everything. And then he left, and he has not come back. And the silence that followed is not a wound, and not a mystery, and not an absence that needs to be filled. It is simply the shape of a decision made by a private man who always knew, better than anyone around him, exactly what he needed, and who found, in the end, that what he needed was this: to stop, completely, permanently, without explanation, and to be, for the first time in 25 years, no one's bandmate and no one's bassist and no one's public property. Just John Deacon. Whoever that turns out to be, in a life lived entirely away from the stage, he walked off in Paris in January 1997 and has never returned to since.